Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. I am here today with Father Mark from St. Jacob of Alaska Church in Northfield Falls, Vermont. Father Mark is actually a priest in the Orthodox Church, and I'm really looking forward today to learning a little bit more about the history of the Orthodox Church and questioning him about militarism in the Orthodox Church, which is something I don't really know much about. So welcome, Father Mark. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Ellen.
What else can you tell us about yourself before we get started? How did you end up being a priest? Did you grow up in the Orthodox Church? What led you to this point in life?
Well, I probably should give you the short version. I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, so I'm very familiar with the Catholic Church. I was a child when the Mass was still in Latin. I remember those years, the early 60s. And then it changed, of course. And when I was a teenager, I went through a lot of what teenagers usually go through, searching for what they can find to be the truth in life, what life is all about. And so I was questioning my participation in the Catholic Church. And so I started looking around at other churches. A few Protestant churches, and eventually I met Father Emmanuel McCarthy, who introduced my wife and I to the Eastern Catholic Church, which we really liked. We loved the liturgy. And this in the early 80s, when he had a liturgy at Boston College. We were living in Boston at the time, and we attended the liturgy there and got to know the Eastern Rite liturgy very well. We moved to Vermont in the late 80s with our children because we wanted to raise them outside of the city. So we moved to Vermont, and in Vermont, there's really no access to the Eastern Catholic Church. It's more of a urban phenomenon, not rural. But there was an Orthodox church nearby that we discovered and started attending there because the liturgy in the Orthodox Church is the same pretty much as the Eastern Rite Catholic Church. There are some theological differences, but liturgically it's almost identical. So we went there, and I had felt a call to the priesthood actually from my childhood, and I was planning on being a Catholic priest until I met my wife, and then that idea went out the window. And I discovered when we were in the Orthodox Church, or actually in the Eastern Rite Catholic Church, that priests can be married. So I realized I could be married and be a priest at that point. And so I pursued that vocation again and ended up going to seminary, an Orthodox seminary, and then was ordained to the diaconate. And I served as a deacon in a couple of parishes for 11 years, and then was ordained to the priesthood about 18 years ago. So now I'm a pastor of a small parish in Northfield Falls, Vermont, which is near Montpelier, the capital, about 50 or 60 people. So it's a small parish. And so I'm working there. I also work as a carpenter to supplement our income. So between the two, we seem to be able to make a living.
Wow, what a story. And you have children, correct? How many children do you have?
Yes, we have 6 children and 15 grandchildren.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. That's great. And you actually make, I know you told me this is a whole different topic, but you actually make caskets, correct?
That's right. About 20, 25 years ago, I started looking into the whole Christian approach to end-of-life care and burial. And I found out that we were not doing our funerals, for the most part, in the very older traditional way, which was for members of the parish to take care of the deceased, to prepare the body, to make a casket, to have the viewing in the home, to bring the casket with the body to the church, and from the church directly to the graveyard. That's how it was done forever. in previous centuries. But the funeral industry took over that role in the early 20th century, and the church lost that contact with end-of-life care, which is a really sad development because there's a lot of powerful experience to be had by taking care of our own departed. So I was trying to help people, especially in the church, rediscover this older form of taking care of the departed. So I started making caskets because at the time there were very few available. You had to buy them at the funeral home, these expensive, overly done, in my opinion, caskets. So I wanted to make a simple pine casket that would be relatively affordable and make it available to people.
Wow, that's really neat. And before we move on and get into all the militarism stuff, can anybody order that from you, or is that only for local people?
Yes, anybody can order. The problem is trying to ship them long distance.
Yeah.
It's very expensive because they're big. It is possible to get them shipped long distance, but I tend to supply mostly people in the Northeast because of the shipping costs. There are other makers now. There's lots of them. If you look online, you might be able to find one more to cut down on the shipping cost.
Okay, and what's your website in case people are interested in looking into that?
Yeah, it's the same as my name, Korban, Korban, workshop, korbanworkshop.com.
Okay, well, thanks. That's really interesting, and I'd love to have you back sometime. I'm really interested in that whole green burial movement and trying to get, like you said, I just think that's important. The care of the body, the care of the dead. I feel like something's really been taken away from us that we don't experience that. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. I am really interested in the Orthodox Church. I think I've become really interested in it lately because I've seen what's happening over in Russia. And specifically, I noticed in the last couple of years, I've noticed a lot of more traditional Catholics, or I guess conservative would be a better word, conservative Catholics, kind of lauding and praising Russia because of their embrace of Christianity. And they see Russia as being a country that's getting back to its Christian roots. And I think they see the United States as being a country that is losing touch with its Christian roots. And specifically, and the forbidding of gay marriage, gay adoption. And so I've been kind of interested in that. And I know that the Orthodox Church is the preeminent church in Russia. And I know so little about it. And then I got a lot more interested last month when I saw the cathedral that had been built. It's a military cathedral, and I almost need to do a whole different episode on that. But basically, it was a military cathedral constructed to celebrate the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. The murals in the cathedral have soldiers in them. The Virgin Mary presiding over the armies. It's a commemoration to that victory. They pray that they will have future victories. Even the materials of the cathedral itself are made out of like supposedly melted tanks and melted weapons. Yes. And so I thought to myself, gosh, this is everything we stand against at our website, is this militarization of the church. And I had never seen it on quite that scale before. And so I was wondering, is this the way the Orthodox Church tends to be? Does this represent the Orthodox Church in terms of its embrace of the military war, state victories over other countries? Or is this kind of an anomaly? It's just a propaganda thing that's being done by Putin? I don't really know what kind of sense to make of it. And I know you're not Russian. You've never lived in Russia, as far as I know. But this is what got me interested in it. So I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Orthodox Church and your experience with that.
Yeah, I would say that cathedral and the Russian attitude, not the entire Russian Orthodox Church, but a certain element of the Russian Orthodox Church, that's the extreme view, that not all Orthodox feel that way or believe that way. So what you saw in that film of the dedication of the cathedral last month is not the widespread understanding of orthodoxy by many Orthodox, I would say.
Okay.
I'm not Russian Orthodox myself. The jurisdiction I'm in is called the Orthodox Church in America, OCA, and it's the child of the Russian Orthodox Church. So when the Russian Orthodox immigrants came here, they brought the Russian Orthodox Church with them. And then around 1970, we were given independence from the Russian bishops. So we're still in communion with Russia, but we have our own American bishops now in North America. So we have a lot of Russian heritage in our jurisdiction, but we're not specifically Russian.
Okay. And then
So,
how did the whole Orthodox Church come to be? How is it different, just on a very broad strokes here, how is it different from the Catholic Church? Because I know that you do have valid sacraments, but there's a break there for sure. So can you explain that?
yeah, so you know probably that there was only one Christian church for the first 1,000 years of Christianity. There was a split in 1054 between the West and the East. The West became known as the Roman Catholic Church. The East became known as the Eastern Orthodox Church. So before that, there was no titles per se. So there was one Christian church at East and West, but they were all in communion with one another. There was a split in, as you know, it culminated in 1054 when the two churches excommunicated each other, basically. And that has never been repaired since. The problem was that they were drifting apart for centuries before 1054 for cultural reasons, liturgical reasons, reasons of understanding the role of the Pope, and some theological differences. And it culminated in 1054. So, but it had been building for several centuries before that. And the difference is that the Orthodox Church is not under the rule of the Pope. We still respect the Pope as first among equals. We have that title for him. But we do not accept that one person rules the entire church, that the church is ruled by what's called the Council of Bishops. It's a conciliar church. So all the bishops together rule the church, and no one bishop has solo say in any decisions. So they make decisions in a council. And then it's interesting, the people have to support that decision that the bishops make. And if they don't support it, it doesn't fly. And there have been instances in church history where the people didn't support the decision of the bishops, and the bishops had to rescind their decision because they came to agree that the people were right, that they had made a wrong decision. So it's much more, I don't want to use the word, probably it's much more democratic than the Roman model. And I like that kind of, everybody from the bottom up has input into the decision-making of the church, at least in theory.
Okay, all right, thanks. That was a great explanation. I didn't know that. So I'm curious as to how, we have certain doctrines in the Roman Catholic Church that sort of govern or are guidelines for how we approach war and violence. And basically we talk a lot on my podcast about nonviolence and just war as the two options. And I think in the early 2000s, the catechism that came out now calls it the just defense doctrine. So they've moved away from even calling it the just war theory or doctrine, and they call it just defense, I think to emphasize that it truly is meant for defense. In the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, I've been a Catholic my whole life. I never knew that there was something called Christian nonviolence until I met Father McCarthy about 10 years ago. And a few of his people in his circles. And I, all of a sudden, I was really shocked by that because I didn't know that was even a thing in our church. So I went on this process of discovery, looking into that, looking into the history of the just war theory, and realizing that many of my fellow Catholics had really given it just about as much thought as I had, which is this much. And so I was wondering, has it developed the same way in the Orthodox Church? Do you guys have something called a just war theory? Do you have those two traditions in your church? What does that look like?
Well, nonviolence, as you know, is nothing new to the church. Just the word nonviolence is new. It's used as an adjective to describe the kind of love that Jesus taught in the Gospels, as opposed to violent love, because there is such a thing as violent love. So we want to qualify that the love that Jesus is teaching is nonviolent love. In the Orthodox Church, we rejected the just war theory, and we consider all war to be a manifestation of human sin and evil. It's a manifestation of evil, and so we've never tried to use the just war theory to justify Christian participation in warfare. However, many Orthodox Christians, as you saw from the film in the Russian cathedral, many Orthodox Christians are fighting in wars and have fought in wars for many centuries. It's nothing new. And the justification is probably as obscure as in the West with the just war theory. There is a just war theory in the West, but the principles of the just war theory are not well known and hardly ever articulated in terms of the average person in the pew. People don't know, they just say, oh, I'm a just war Christian, but don't understand, well, the war has to meet these criteria in order to be considered a just war. They just say, I'm a just war theory. Well, in the East, we say, if we even say it, we say another principle called economia, or economy, which is just a way to exercise church canons, church rules, church guidelines in a way that is merciful and helpful to people. So in certain situations, strict rules can be relaxed in order to accommodate a more merciful, loving approach. So we would say that in terms of protecting people, we might bless someone to go off and fight in a war. The problem is it's done in the same fashion that the just war theory is, very foggy, very vague, and nobody ever really articulates, as far as I've seen, what these principles are, that where economia can be invoked and it's okay. It's just more of a sense of, well, this seems like a just war to me, so go ahead and fight, and people are blessed to go and do that, even though we consider it a sin. So it's never really been worked out. As far as I know, no one has really laid out a clear guideline or prescription of how we're supposed to deal with this. It's just kind of like the just war theory. Everybody has their own idea of what it means.
Yeah, very subjective and up for interpretation, and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it hasn't really seriously been worked out and discussed. So part of my ministry is to try to bring that topic to people's attention and begin some kind of discussion for clarification on that whole issue. Saint Basil, who is a saint, I think, also in the Catholic Church in the late 4th century, and Saint John Chrysostom, same time period, both required soldiers returning from war, if they had killed somebody, to be excommunicated for 3 years and do repentance, do penance for 3 years. That was later dropped, that requirement, and then it just became a rule for the clergy. The clergy cannot participate in warfare, and that's still the rule today. So clergy are not allowed to take up a weapon and kill anyone, and they're not even allowed to, if they kill someone in a car accident, that life is considered so sacred that they might not be able to continue as a priest, depending on what the bishop says about it. Life is considered sacred. So it's an inconsistency. We have two standards, one for the clergy and monastics and one for the lay people.
Okay, yeah, I think we have the same thing. I know that in World War II or World War I, there were a lot of Catholic priests who fought in World War I, but I know that now, I might be wrong about the exact rules, but I don't think Catholic chaplains in the military can carry a weapon. And I've known men in the military before who said that they had a real problem with that when they were in the military and their chaplains were praying with them and blessing them, but they thought, well, why aren't you carrying a weapon? Why do I have to do that, but you don't have to do that? What, so.
Good question.
Yeah. So what is it like in the Orthodox Church? Do you think people are pretty similar to Roman Catholics in the sense that 99% of them will just say, I'm a just war Catholic, you have a right to self-defense, and that's kind of the end of it?
Yeah, it's just war. Even though we don't have the just war theory in the Orthodox Church, people will say, I believe in the just war. And it's just a part of life, going into the military is just a normal, honorable part of life. It's considered self-sacrificial. It's considered something to be honored and praised, just like it is in the Catholic Church, Protestant Church, or in society in general. So the atmosphere is pretty much the same. The only thing is, theologically, we don't have to deal with the just war theory, which is wonderful.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
It makes it a little easier.
Given that you've kind of been thinking about this for a long time, and I guess it's part of your ministry, like if you were the Pope, and I know you don't believe in, Pope, but if you were.
I do believe in the Pope.
Oh, you do? But
we believe him as the first among equals.
Oh.
But not the ruler of the entire church.
Oh, okay. Well, if you were the ruler of the entire church, what do you think would need to happen to, like, what are some concrete steps that the churches could take, whether, like you said, Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, evangelical, to come back to the way of the nonviolent Jesus and move away from this justification of violence and war? Is there anything that comes to mind that you think could be done to improve that situation and to give people more clarity, to form their consciences in a different way? Anything?
You mean if I was the ruler of the church or as a priest in a parish?
That's a good question. Maybe we should say priest in a parish, since that's
the only thing. It's the only thing I have access to.
Yeah.
So education, number one, which you're trying to do, and I'm trying to do to some extent, and Father Emmanuel has done for, I don't know, about 50 years now.
Yeah.
He's educated lots and lots of people about this who knew nothing about this. And so he's had an incredible ministry, and many other people have worked on this. So education, definitely number one. I think then some kind of pastoral help in terms of helping people get over the fear of what will happen if I take Jesus seriously. So if you listen to people in parishes, there's a lot of fear about what would happen if we took Jesus seriously. We'd probably return to a situation like the early Christians where we would be persecuted. And that's not something that's fun to look forward to, So there's a lot of fear there. So Father Emmanuel is asking the church to accept being persecuted again. And so that requires a lot of pastoral support in order for that to happen. So it's a huge task. I'm not sure how it's going to happen, whether, it will take another couple of millennia for the message to be gotten by people. I talked a lot about this actually with Father Emmanuel. How can we go about teaching people this, or how can we bring it about? What can we do in our own little way to help that to happen? And, it's kind of baffling in a way, because Father Emmanuel spent 45 years. I've been at this 40 years, and feels like little to no progress has been made. So I'm not sure where to go except to try to be faithful to what Jesus taught, to pass on what he taught, and then leave the results up to him. And he's got a plan. He's working on something. Mm-hmm. And my part, I'm seeing my part as doing my piece, whatever that may be, in his plan. And then how it works out in the long run and how the church is changed is up to him. I can't really do that myself.
Yeah, there's a lot of humility. I think that has to go along with that. You know, it's the 75th anniversary today of July 16th of the first detonation of the first nuclear weapon.
Yes.
And it always just boggles my mind now that I'm kind of 10 years into this journey, that people will continue to defend the just defense theory when this is kind of where it brought us after centuries and centuries and centuries. This explosion of this powerful weapon. These have now been made all over the world. I think there's up to 9 countries now that are creating these weapons.
Yeah.
And we see with Obama and President Trump that they want to renew our nuclear arsenal. And it seems obvious to me that that can lead nowhere except to the end of the world. I mean, they have the explosive power that's like 50,000 times of what it had back in the 1940s. And if one person launches one, it's over. And yet we still see Christians around the world just defending this. And when I saw that video of Russia and their military cathedral and praying that God would be on their side and praying for future victories, and then I hear the rhetoric in the United States, it's very anti-Russia, it's very anti-China. Well, the Russians are Christians too, and they think God's on their side. We would obviously think God's on our side, and it's just World War I all over again, but on a much, much larger scale. So do you think that something like that is going to have to happen before we return to Jesus' teachings?
Something like what?
Something like another war, World War III, or?
Well, I hope not. Certainly hope not. I don't know how this is going to resolve. It is extremely dangerous, as you say. It's interesting. I first became aware of nuclear weapons when I was about 14. I remember when it first came to my consciousness that the world was sitting underneath a Damocles sword that could fall any second. I was sitting outside at my high school. I went to a Catholic high school and I was on break, I don't know, outside sitting, and it hit me. And I was just sitting there with tears streaming down my face, realizing that my life was not going to be this carefree thing that it had been up to that point. And interesting also at that time that my Catholic priest in my parish got up, well, maybe what was that, 1969? He got up and gave a sermon one Sunday against the Vietnam War, which is, really radical. And that was my first push toward nonviolence, that sermon, because there were several people in the congregation who were really angry. And they stood up, one guy stood up and said, "We're here to pray, not talk politics." And he stormed out the door. And then the parish council president stood up and said, "I make a motion that we just continue the Mass." And so the sermon ended and the Mass continued. But I was 14, and that shook my world, that whole incident, because when you're young, things make a deep impression on you. And that's what started me on the path to discovering the nonviolent Jesus, that sermon. So I thank my Catholic priests and my Catholic heritage for getting me on this path. I learned it from that, began learning it from that heritage.
Wow. And
Yeah.
what do you remember what he said in that sermon that was so impression, it made such an impression on you?
What did he say? I don't remember the actual words. I just have a kind of general impression that he was saying in a very kind of agitated voice that the war was wrong and that we shouldn't be fighting in Vietnam. I don't remember the exact wording though.
Yeah.
But I remember the response, which was electrifying.
Yeah.
It was electrifying.
Wow. That's awesome.
It was courageous. And I went to see him, I don't know, maybe 30 years later. He was still a parish priest in another parish than the one I grew up in. And I asked him about it. He said he remembered the incident, but that it was kind of a youthful indiscretion, which was kind of sad.
Oh, so as he went on in his journey as a priest, he figured out that you shouldn't do that.
I think he accommodated himself more to the status quo.
Yeah. I'm consistently disappointed these days when I go to Mass. I feel like the homilies I hear are so disconnected from what's happening in our society and what's happening in our world. I mean, the only topic they will address is abortion, which is good that they talk about that, but everything else is almost off the table. And I feel like these homilies that I hear at church, I could hear them in 2020. I could hear them in 1990. I could hear them in 1250. Like, you could hear these homilies at any time in human history, and it would fit. And I understand that you want to do something that's universal, but there sure doesn't seem to me to be a lot of priests that are speaking to these kind of pressing issues.
Yeah, no, that's true. And the thing is that I'm sure you're well aware of the connection between abortion and war. So if we're going to say we're against abortion because life is sacred, then we got to be against war too, and capital punishment. It just logically makes sense if life is sacred. So that's where the disconnect is, I think. Why are we against only abortion? Is only innocent life sacred? Is that what we're saying? Only innocent life, sinless life? If that's the case, we're in deep trouble, because we're all sinners beyond, 4 or 5 years old. We start sinning, 7 years old, whatever, we start sinning. And so if only innocent life is sacred, then none of us are sacred beyond 7 years old or so. So it's very logically inconsistent to be against abortion and not against war and capital punishment.
Yeah. I've often thought, with all these riots that are going on and the desecration of Christian statues, everyone's making a big deal out of that, and I understand it's very upsetting. But in my mind, I oftentimes have a picture of like a statue of a saint and a BLM protester or an Antifa person, and I ask myself, like, which one of these is a temple of the Holy Spirit? I think if you look at it that way, it just kind of casts things in a different light. But I don't think that we see people as temples of the Holy Spirit. They're just on our side, or they're on their side. They're a friend or an enemy.
Yes.
And
Well, the whole argument against war from the gospel perspective is that each person is sacred. Each person is a child of God, infinitely loved by God. And so we have no right to kill that person, that it's better to die than to kill. So that's the message that's really difficult for Christians to absorb today. And I can understand why. I mean, you're taking a huge risk if you're going to follow that kind of teaching. And it took Jesus to inaugurate that teaching. He had to come and really get the thing going, and the Christians followed it for the first 300 years. And then we lost that consciousness. And to get it back, I don't know, I almost think Jesus has to come again and reignite the church,
Yeah, I tried to explain it once to one of my friends, and he said, it's a great idea, Ellen, but it just wouldn't work. I mean, they would abolish the churches, they would eradicate us, they would just kill us all off, whoever they are, the Russians, the Marxists, the BLM people. And I said, well, if you look at Jesus, it kind of looks like it doesn't work, right? I mean, if you look at Jesus on the cross, it looks like it doesn't work, but I went on and tried to explain it, and after a while he said, so what you're saying is that it doesn't work, but it's working. And I just thought that was kind of brilliant, the way he put that, because I've often thought about that. It doesn't work, but it's working. And it's like in the present tense. And it's, I don't know how to explain it.
How do you mean that, Ellen? I'm not quite following.
Well, nonviolence, if you look at, nonviolence doesn't work. I mean, there are incidences where nonviolent, in terms of tactics, it will work. If you look at Gandhi or whatever. But most people, if somebody has a gun and you don't, the person with the gun can kill you. You probably can't kill them. I mean, on a logical level, it just doesn't work. But it is the way of Jesus. And it's even if we can't see, I don't know, we can't see that it has worked, it is working. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this, but maybe it's a mystery I really can't understand myself.
Well, I think Father Emmanuel says over and over and over again that it works on the invisible side of existence,
Yeah.
invisible side of reality. Nonviolence works. On the visible side, it's not as apparent. You don't see it as much, but it is working. But you have to trust Jesus that that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem that Father Emmanuel puts his finger on. Do we trust Jesus or don't we? Do we believe to be the eternal Son of the eternal God? And if so, then he's totally trustworthy and we can follow him, even though we don't understand where he's exactly how this works.
Mm-hmm.
But because we trust him, we do it. So the early Christians were dying by the hundreds, thousands maybe, the apostles and so forth, trusting that this was bringing about the kingdom of God on earth in a way that they could not immediately perceive.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what it comes to. Are we willing to go that far in our trust for Jesus and say, okay, if it comes to being martyred, I'll do it because Jesus said this is the way and I want to follow him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. That's the bottom line. And that's tough. That's a tough thing, It takes a strong faith.
Yeah, and from our human perspective, looking at, what the Russians did in World War II and their victory, it's like, oh, that worked, but God tells us that like the meaning of our actions, the smallest act of love is worth more, can be worth something eternal, whereas a worldly act that's done without love is worth nothing. Absolutely. But from our human perspective, we can't really see it that way. It's a big topic. But I always like to tell people that when you learn about Christian nonviolence, it's not really so much about that moment in your life where you're going to have to make that kind of decision. It will start affecting your life in much smaller ways on an everyday basis. It's not about that final moment of decision.
Yeah, it's when your spouse annoys you. Can you be patient with your spouse? That's nonviolence.
Yeah.
Or you're driving down the street and someone cuts you off. Can you say a prayer for them instead of cursing them? On and on, all these little incidences through the day. I have a negative thought towards someone. That's violence. Mm-hmm. Can I turn that to nonviolence? Can I give a blessing to that person instead of that negative thought? Mm-hmm. So if we practice nonviolence in those tiny little ways every day, when the big thing comes, we'll be ready.
Right. And if we don't, when the big thing comes, we have no hope of loving in that moment because we've never been practicing loving in the smaller movements.
Yes, exactly. It's a skill. Nonviolent love is a skill that we practice and get better at as we practice.
Yeah, and I think it's creative too. It's like in the moment. In the Behold the Lamb tapes that Father McCarthy, he tells a story about the 1960s and in the South, and this community of people were being attacked because they were working alongside Black people, or it might have been earlier than that. But it's the
1950s.
1950s.
Koinoinia Farm.
Yeah. And what this man did in this moment of confrontation that was very creative, and those creative solutions that will come to us when we put down the gun, put down the just defense mentality that otherwise wouldn't even occur to us. Right. So if you all haven't listened to Behold the Lamb, you should.
Right. Yeah. That's Clarence Jordan. He was a Baptist minister who was integrating the South in the 1940s, way before Martin Luther King. So basically taking his life in his hands, but he grew up there and that was his home. So he knew the people. So it was a good place for him to be. But my wife grew up at Koinoinia Farm.
Oh, really?
In the late 60s and early 70s. So I went there for a while too. We met there actually. So
I didn't know that.
We have a very strong connection with Koinoinia Farm. But Clarence Jordan was an amazing man. If you ever have a chance to read his books or listen to his recordings, there are some recordings available. He's an amazing preacher, a really good Southern Baptist preacher. But he's very funny too. He's extremely comical. And he said, I was riding down the back road one day in my pickup truck a dirt road, and these two guys all of a sudden are standing in front of me, in front of my truck with shotguns. And I said to myself, I know what's coming. I know what these guys are going to do, because they knew who he was and they didn't like what he was doing at Koinoinia Farm with the black people. So he knew what it was about. So he said, I did what Jesus said. I turned both my cheeks and went the other way.
That's pretty good. I like that.
Yeah, it's so funny. He's so funny.
Well, maybe I'll have to talk to your wife sometime about, did she grow up Baptist or was she?
Mennonite. She grew up Mennonite. Koinonia is an ecumenical place, not really a Baptist place. So there were Catholics, Mennonites, all kinds of denominations there.
Wow. And I think it's still around today as a community.
Still there, yes. It's changed quite a bit, but it's still there. And Habitat for Humanity had its start at Koinonia Farm.
Oh, wow. That's great.
So, yeah.
Oh, how neat. And that's where you met and fell in love.
Fell in love and moved away, and here we are.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Father Mark. I enjoyed the conversation.
Okay.
And is there anything else that you'd like to finish up with or mention if you haven't said so far?
Let's see here. I did want to mention this guy I talked to you privately about, this Kalashnikov, Mikhail Kalashnikov. Could I mention him?
Oh, you mentioned him on the phone. This is a great story. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's a Russian guy. He was born in 1919, died in 2013. And 6 months before he died, he sent a letter to Patriarch Kirill, because Kalashnikov was Orthodox. And he had invented in 1947 a rifle called the Kalashnikov rifle, which is a very famous, well-known rifle around the world, the most numerous rifle, 72 million in circulation today. And it's called the gun that changed the world, because he was a military guy who was dissatisfied with the quality of the Russian rifles during World War II. So he was an engineer and decided to make a better rifle. So he made this rifle that's extremely dependable, hot weather, cold weather, desert, frozen north, wherever you are, it works really well. And very dependable, very cheap to make, and very easy to maintain. So it's used by governments all over the world, by revolutionary groups, by terrorists, and he never got involved in the manufacture of them. He never made a dime off of them himself, but he initiated the whole Kalashnikov rifle thing. So he was in his 90s in 2013 and getting near death, and was feeling guilty about all the deaths that had come about because of his invention. Mm-hmm. So he wrote a letter to Patriarch Kirill in 2014, which was published after his death, but it had been written 6 months before his death. And he was confessing that he was feeling, quote, spiritual pain because of the deaths caused by his invention. And he said, I keep having the same unsolved question. If my rifle claimed people's lives, then can it be that I, a Christian and an Orthodox believer, was to blame for their deaths? So he's basically making a confession on his deathbed. And the Patriarch responded, this is an example of patriotism and a correct attitude toward the country. The church has a well-defined position when the weapon is in defense of the motherland. The church supports its creators and the military which use it. So that's basically where the Russian church is, and probably a common attitude across the entire Orthodox Church, I'm sad to say. Kalashnikov said, I would have preferred to have invented a machine that people could use and that would help farmers with their work. For example, a lawnmower.
Wow. So
this is, at the end of his life when he sees what happened. So normally when a person comes to a clergyman, a priest or bishop with a confession like that, you don't try to talk them out of what they're feeling about what they've done. You try to help them toward repentance. So I think there was a pastoral error there.
Can you read again the quote of what the patriarch said to him?
He said, "It's an example of patriotism and a correct attitude toward the country. The church has a well-defined position when the weapon is defense of the motherland. The church supports its creators and the military which use it."
Wow.
I don't know what that well-defined position is because I've never seen anything in writing to that effect. So I don't know exactly what he's referring to with that well-defined position.
Wow. And it makes me think going back to that military cathedral, I think it's called Patriotic Square is what it's named. Yeah. So this idea of patriotism, that anything can be, I don't know, licit, I guess, morally, if you're doing it for patriotic reasons. That's a shame.
Yeah. Well, that's the same for any country. So their country would feel that way for their military. Ours feels that way for ours. This one feels that way. And so every country, the people in each country feel that way about their own military. So what happens when this Christian country feels that way about their military? We feel about this way, and then the Christians are fighting. Mm-hmm. So it's like the ultimate betrayal of the gospel, you know?
It is, for sure. Yeah, and thinking about him putting his time, his life's time, and his mental skills, his intelligence toward building that rifle. And then I'm thinking about, you know, the people who put their intelligence toward building these atomic bombs back during the Manhattan Project. Yeah. People around the world who are inventing new viruses for biological warfare, and how infrequently our churches actually speak about that too. Which I think Father McCarthy has been putting out on his email list for the past few days, is this idea of what are you using your time for on this earth?
Yeah. What are you using your talents for, your gifts for? Is it enhancing life, or is it not? Is it, you know, detracting from life?
Yeah.
Because Christ, we say in the Orthodox Church on Pascha, Easter, Christ tramples down death by death. So that means his death, he trampled down all forms of death, not just death at the end of life. Anything that results in death dealing, he tramples down. Wow. And so making rifles, making tanks, making bombs, making biological weapons, all this is death dealing. And so Christ came to trample that all down. But he needs us to do it with him. He's not going to do it with snapping his fingers, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, we have to participate in that. Yeah, and that makes me think too about how they named the test site for the bomb that was tested on July 16th, Trinity site. And yes. It was the Trinity test. And I think Oppenheimer named that after John Donne's poetry. John Donne, who wrote "Death, Thou Shalt Die." I mean, John Donne was a very religious poet, beautiful Christian poetry. "Batter my heart, three-person God." And Oppenheimer said he was inspired by that to name this test of the nuclear bomb after the Trinity. It seems like such a sacrilege to me.
Yeah, sure, yes.
You know?
You have to wonder where it came from.
Exactly.
What part of the deep part of his being did that well up from, you know?
Right.
It's an interesting mystery on the invisible side of life.
Yes, and the powers and principalities that are at work always.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, didn't he quote the Bhagavad Gita too during that?
He said after it exploded, he's reported to have said, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds."
Yeah, right.
And where is that from again? I don't remember.
I think it's from the Bhagavad Gita, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
I'd have to check that, but I think that's where it's from.
Wow. I was going to ask you, do you have 5 more minutes?
Yes, I do.
You do? Okay. What do you think about is it called the Hagia Sophia? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, Hagia Sophia.
Hagia Sophia. That recently was turned into a mosque. Do you have any thoughts on that? And I've seen it in the news. I don't know a lot about the history of the church.
It was originally a Christian cathedral built in, I believe, the 500s, commissioned by the Emperor Justinian. And it's huge. You've probably never been there, but the thing is, somebody told me it's the length of 3 football fields.
Oh, wow.
And it's incredibly tall dome with lights around the dome. It makes the dome look like it's floating in the middle of the air. Wow. Incredibly architecturally complicated. But anyway, it was a Christian church until the Turks took over in the 1400s. They turned it into a mosque. In the 1930s, it was turned into a museum. So it was not an active mosque anymore. It was a museum. But there are still some mosque elements inside the church covering up the icons. And then, last week, the president of Turkey said he wanted to turn it back into an active mosque. So that's basically what the story is.
Okay.
I don't have any particular feelings about it. I probably, if you look through history, there's a lot of instances where Christians took over some other faith buildings.
Yeah.
So, turnabout is fair play, as they say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. I haven't read much about it. It kind of occurred to me. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Father Mark. It's been nice talking to you.
You too. Thank you. And we can talk again sometime about the end of life care.
I would like to do that. I would like to do that. I think that'd be a good, even though it has not much to do with militarism and war and everything, I do think this respect for the body and kind of that being in touch with our own mortality, is important. And maybe that plays into what you're talking about with the fear of death, because we don't experience that, through others before we have to go through it ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's very true. If we can overcome the fear of death, we've overcome fear. All fear is rooted in the fear of death. So that's important. But one tidbit, Ellen, there is a direct connection between warfare and the way we do funerals in the US, I should say. The funeral industry got its start during the Civil War, when the bodies of the Confederate soldiers had to be shipped, the dead bodies, back to the South in the heat. They would start decaying. So they came up with an embalming. That's when embalming started in the US. So they embalmed the soldiers before they shipped them back to the South. Because, the shipping was slow back in those days by train, Yeah. So that's where the funeral industry got its start, because only the funeral industry can do embalming. You can't do that at home. So once they got control of the embalming, they gradually got control of the whole funeral industry and made a big business out of it. And so there is a connection between war and funerals.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it is interesting. And there's a lot of violence that goes into embalming. Incredibly violent process. If you want to go on YouTube and see it, it's pretty ugly. But the body is basically desecrated during embalming. So it's not upholding the sacredness of the body.
Wow. Very interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Father Mark. This has been fascinating. I can't wait to make the notes for this episode, because we've covered so many interesting topics, and I think people will be interested in looking into them more. So thank you.
You're welcome, and take care, Ellen.
All right, you too.